Okay, hello. So I am giving a demonstration now on how to do your techniques or your practice with watercolor. Several of you took tempera paints, the big cakes of tempera paints. Some of you took watercolor, some of you took both. So the traditional pan watercolors um, can be dry, right? And then you activate them with water. And tempera cakes are the same way. So you can use them the same way. You just may have to add a little bit more water to them to get the watercolor type effect. So if you do not have watercolors, do not fret. Do not go out and buy any. Just use the materials that you took from me, okay? All right, so we're gonna talk about all the stuff that you're gonna need. What I did was I took a piece of that 12 by 9 paper and I cut it in half, okay? So that way you can do your test strip on one half of it. The other half you can use for practice if you want to. After I folded that in half, cut it in half, I taped it down super well to a nice piece of cardboard. If you tape it down to anything rigid, it's going to lay mostly flat like this ended up. What happens is with this type of paper, even though it's made for both wet and dry processes, it's going to take water on, it's going to expand, it's going to warp like crazy because of all the sizing and glue and paper fibers. And then when it comes back to its original shape, it's not going to be the same no matter what. And so we want to get it as close as possible to the same by taping it down really well and letting it dry completely before you do your video reflection on Flipgrid. I have some notes on Flipgrid about that as well. So make sure it's taped down super duper well. If you don't have masking tape, you can use duct tape. Duct tape works great. And I just make sure that it's like over the border a little bit. Use a template to trace out 9 of these circles in here, and then come up with some different shapes across the bottom for these different things. Go ahead and zoom in real quick so that we can take a look at what's going on with each one of these. I want you to label these wet on wet wash with 2 colors, wet on wet wash with 1 color, wet on wet modeling with a single color, wet on dry modeled with 1 color, wet on dry opaque primary colors, wet on wet analogous, and you're going to fill the entire thing with a wash like we see here. Wet on wet complements, we're going to fill that with a wash. Wet on wet triadic, we're going to fill that entirely with a wash. And then this is going to be about stenciling and spattering. So whatever you use for a template for this, you'll want to create some kind of a stencil. And what I did was I just took a heavy duty piece of paper and like I think it's maybe, I don't know, poster board or something like that. And I took the same, it was a lid to a water bottle. I took the same lid and I laid it on here, traced around it, and cut it out with an X-Acto knife. That way I had a stencil that would keep all of this other stuff nice and clean so that when I spatter, it stayed right inside of here. I changed these up a little bit because I wanted bigger areas for the wax resist, the plastic wrap texture. I wrote saran wrap texture here, brand name, and salt wash here, okay? Okay, so if you don't have masking tape, you need some, right? I would find some kind of plastic wrap. If you don't have saran wrap, it's okay to use like a Ziploc bag that you've cut open, any kind of plastic, whatever that is basically, it needs to be able to trap the water and the pigment on the paper, right? So it should be non-porous. You could probably use Press Seal, but that's got a touch of porosity to it. Give it a shot. It's a good idea to have a candle. If you have some tea lights, cool. If not, you can go ahead and use like crayon. I have a white crayon here. I also have a yellow crayon. You can use whatever you need to do the wax resist. While I'm thinking about that, I'm gonna go ahead and light this because I need molten wax in order to really get that to happen. You'll need salt. Table salt's fine. I wouldn't use super coarse salt. I definitely wouldn't use any kind of salt that's like for de-icing because that's too coarse. Let's see what else. In terms of a brush, I just use a single brush for all of this. I just use a medium-sized round brush. Whatever you grab is probably gonna be fine. And then I like to use a toothbrush or a really stiff, short bristled brush for the splatter texture. It seems to work best if you use it that way. So this is an old toothbrush that one of my family members used. I just dunked it in bleach so it's not gross. I have several cans of water here, just because I don't want to have to like change my water while I'm demonstrating. If you want to use a single cup of water, that's fine, but know that you're gonna have to change it often. And have a lot of napkins, paper towels, whatever. Don't use toilet paper. Apparently toilet paper doesn't work very well these days. It's a little bit on the short side of supply, right? Also, since you've done your color wheel, it's a good idea to have a color wheel reference handy. If you're not sure about things like analogous colors, primary colors, triadic colors, and the like. So I just made myself a new color wheel with colored pencils, that kind of thing. So I'm gonna leave this out here for demonstration purposes. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and like hydrate my colors. And by doing that, I'm just, I'm trying not to actually touch my brush on any of these colors. That way I don't mix the pigments. If you do mix the pigments, it's no big deal. You can always like wipe it out with a paper towel later, but I'm trying to avoid that now. By adding water to these now and getting them hydrated, it's gonna have a much greater pigment load later, and it's gonna be easier for you to execute the painting as you want. I will use a little bit of black, but mostly I'm gonna use color. Okay. So I feel like I have that looking pretty good. Like each one of them is pretty well saturated. Then I'm just gonna let them sit. I'm gonna put them aside. If I have a bunch of pigment on my brush, then I would clean it out, but I'm good for now. So, all right, what I'm gonna start with first is, let's take a look here. I think probably the best thing to do is to layer wax for the wax resist. So I'm gonna take my white. And white's cool because kids think it's really magical when you lay that down and then paint, and then it resists the water. It's kind of a sciencey thing that you can incorporate into your lesson. So I've got some of those. I'm gonna do a little bit of yellow in there too. And then I'm gonna do a little bit with this tea light. Let's see, where did my toothpick go? So I like to take a toothpick and draw into my white space with molten wax. I think I'm gonna do like some splattery type stuff just to practice a little bit. Might even just a little pour there, see what happens. Oh man, that's gonna be really resistive. At any rate, I'm done with that now. Okay, let's see. I think I'm gonna go ahead and start with my plastic wrap texture. So for anything that says that it's wet on wet, you first have to wet your paper, and you have to wet your paper with clean water. You wanna make sure that it doesn't have a pigment to it. When you do this, you can see the water set right on the surface of the paper. It's gonna have kind of like a little bit of a shine, so I kind of angle my face a little bit so that I can see the light bounce off of it. I add a good deal of water to this so that it sort of rests on the surface, and I'm just trying to keep it right within the inside of that square. And this is a good thing for students to practice. It gives them brush control practice. Brush control is vastly different from pencil control. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and just throw a couple of colors in there. You can see that I did some red and I did some blue in there. But I wanna create a good wash. So I think I'm just gonna I'm gonna throw a dark one on top. Let it do its thing. Just dotted that in there, rinsed out my brush a little bit. And I'm gonna spread it out some. I don't want it to be super dark, because if it's super dark, sometimes it's hard to see contrast in the saran wrap texture. I'm gonna choose like another color that's close to it on the color wheel, so probably like a red. So I'm gonna stir this up a little bit, drop a little red in the bottom, clean out my brush. I always clean it and dry it out just to make sure that I don't have any latent pigment stuck in there. And then I'm just gonna kind of spread it to fill the edges and let it do its thing. So I want kind of a flat wash on this one. And then what I want to do is I want to differentiate that with the plastic itself. So that one had some pigment on it before, so I'm just gonna use a fresh one. I like to lay this down and let it completely adhere, and then I like to crumple it like this. There's a couple of different ways you can go about doing this. You can actually apply the paint to the plastic and lay it down, see what it looks like. Or you can do it the way that I did it. I prefer this method, it looks better. You're gonna wanna let this dry just a little bit before you go pulling that off. If you pull it off right now, it's not gonna look very good. I'm gonna move to wax resist now, and I'm gonna do another wet on wet process. You can see that my water's getting a little dirty, right? You can see some violet in there. So now I know it's probably a good time for me to switch water. But what I'm gonna do at this juncture is use a nice dark color in there. On this one I used black to really emphasize that white versus black thing. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw some violet in there since this is already violet color. And then the whole idea is that you just want a nice consistent wash, and you'll see it start to completely resist in those areas where there's wax. It's a good thing for kids to see this whole science-y thing of like wax versus water, right? You'll see it beat up on there. And basically you can wipe that stuff off of the surface when you're done with it. The stuff that I like poured in there, it's never gonna get to the paper. It may get to the paper in some of the other areas. You can go in there and dab it if you want, just a little bit, just to kind of clear up some of those spots where maybe you were using crayon. Wax resist is a pretty cool technique. Last one I'm gonna do is salt wash here, and then I'm gonna start moving into these spheres or these circles that we're gonna transform into spheres. Again, wet on wet with this, so I wanna completely apply water to this whole area. I'm trying to get that plastic to move over so I don't disrupt my technique here, and at the same time I can like pull this technique off here. Okay, so you want a lot of water on the salt wash, and you don't want like a super huge amount of pigment here. You actually kind of want a light wash in that. To get this technique, which I kind of feel like it looks like snow, rain, you know, something atmospheric, clouds, whatever, you have to be able to have a fairly consistent wash, and then you're disrupting it by using the salt. And the salt absorbs the water, and it basically deposits the pigment in the salt texture where it's landed. I used blue on that one. I think I'm gonna go ahead and mix up some green. I'll do like a salt wash here. And so that's a lot of pigment actually. I'm probably just gonna go ahead and go across with that, clean my brush out. That way I don't add more pigment. And then I'm just gonna smooth it out so I have a nice, clean, smooth, consistent wash. I'm going a little outside my boundaries, which is fine on this, because I'm not looking to make an illusion of any sort. Now when I kind of feel like that's absorbed pretty well, then I'm gonna work on distributing some salt, maybe heavy in one area and not in another. And the whole key to this is letting it sit. Let it do its thing, and you're gonna get this effect. When it dries, we're gonna peel and scrape off all that salt wash, or all that salt rather on the wash, so it'll work out for you. I'm gonna go ahead and clean the rest of that off. All right, moving to a clean water source at this point. I'm gonna go ahead and do a wet on wet wash, 2 colors. Now again, these little circular swatches are things that I have my students do quite a bit, just because it's good for practicing brush control and planning. Like with watercolor, you really have to do a lot of planning. Let's see, what did I do on this one? I did some blue and green. I feel like that kind of looks like an earth or like, you know, a planet. Let's do something a little bit different. I think I'm gonna throw some yellow in there. The key to a wash, or making a successful wash, is to leave it alone. I had a hard time with this throughout my undergraduate years, graduate years even still. I just wanna mess with it, you know? I wanna make it look cool. Seems like the more you mess with it, the less the less amazing the wash becomes. You just kind of have to let water and pigment do its thing with the paper. Otherwise, you're really not gonna get super sweet results. So I'm gonna leave that alone at this point. So once I've dropped that in there, I know it's gonna disperse, it's gonna do its thing. Just wanna kind of fill it up. Next up, I'm gonna go ahead and do a wet on wet wash. So anytime you see wet on wet, right, you're gonna apply clean water to the swatch. Make sure that you have a consistent amount of water on there. You can see that I don't just do one application of water. I have to go back and add more because it's gonna absorb in, right? This is gonna be a single color here. So I think I'm gonna go with like orange. I'm just gonna like, again, let it do its thing. Because the more you mess with it, it seems like the more it turns into like a more general kind of wash. I don't know, sometimes I like to kind of draw through it with a toothpick. You can practice a little bit of that, see what you think. Okay, next up is gonna be wet on wet modeled. So we wanna take this little circle, right, and transform it into a sphere. So I want you to develop a light source off to the side like this sun, like I developed here. So this is gonna be a light spot here. That means you're probably gonna have a shadow off over here. Now I'm working on this upside down. I hope it looks good. Probably does. I don't know. No? What do you think, Sel?
I think it looks good.
All right, cool.
Looks like a bunch of scribbles.
I'm talking about the shadow.
Yeah, I know.
All right, sweet. All right, so if this is wet on wet, we have to add water, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna add the water first. We're gonna let it soak into the paper a little bit. Because we don't wanna work as quickly as we did over here, because we're modeling this, we want it to look like a marble, a sphere, something like a ball, right? We want it to look like it has dimension. We want to be able to manipulate the color on the surface of this paper. So we kind of want that all to be the same hydration level. So I just give a little bit of time to kind of like work in there. I'm gonna go ahead and pull my texture up here. This is looking like it's dry enough for me to do so. You can see that now, it came out pretty good. So now I'm gonna go ahead and pick a color. I think I'm gonna go with blue on this one. And the goal here is to think about what the darkest area would be. And it would be the furthest area away from the light source, so it'd be over here. Now when you draw a line on this side, it's gonna spread a little bit, like a fuzzy caterpillar or something like that, right? But you can also do things like some stippling to add a little bit of color in there. And as we get closer to that light source, we need to have less and less color, right? So once I get to this point, I clean my brush out and I just work with the pigment that I have on the paper. I like to dry my brush out as well because a lot of times once I have a little bit too much water in there, I can't control it as well. So now we'll kind of start spreading it just a little bit. And the whole goal here is that out here I want like 90% pigment, 10% water, right? But as I get down to this, I want like the opposite. I want like, really more like 10% pigment, maybe more like 90% water as such. I'm gonna go ahead and maybe add just a little bit more blue in here. I feel like it should be a touch darker. I wanna shade that darker. And the nice thing about wet on wet is that it automatically spreads for you. It's not like drawing a line, right? You draw a line, you see a harsh edge. But when you're working with wet on wet watercolor, it automatically sort of spreads out for you and it creates this nice gradation. If you don't like the hard edges here, you can add a little bit of just straight up water to that and you can dilute and dissolve that edge a little bit. Pretty happy with that. Now I'm gonna go ahead and go with some super intense blue for my shadow. Now one thing that's gonna happen, if I touch this edge, it's gonna blend in, right? So I'm being pretty careful at this point right now to make sure that I'm not touching the edge of my sphere. I've left a little tiny little line. Again, good for pencil control, or rather brush control, to kind of help show that shadow. Later when it dries, I'll go back in, I'll clear that up. So I'm gonna move to wet on dry opaque primary. So primary colors, right? Our primaries are yellow, red, and blue. And so we wanna shade this thing only using those three colors. So that means that we have to decide how much of this is gonna be a highlight We're gonna go ahead and shade them from the same direction just to keep things simple. And if we have a highlight on there, that means that we have to keep that white, right? And because this is a wet on dry process, it's kind of like working with ink on dry paper. So I'm just gonna leave this dry. I'm gonna take my brush and load it up with a good deal of just straight up yellow. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say, okay, this should be maybe my highlight here. Should have a nice white area right there where there's no pigment at all. It's gonna be the absolute brightest portion of the sphere. The rest of it, I'm gonna go in and paint straight yellow and just let it dry, okay? So this is kind of like acrylic paint. Think about like painting your house, right? You're just painting it flat. We're gonna let that dry. What we're gonna do next is we're gonna layer on top of that with some reds. You can see here I didn't leave a highlight on there. We're gonna paint on top of that with some reds, and then we're gonna progress with some blues on top of that. So we have to wait for that to dry. So I'm gonna leave that alone at this point. Clean out my brush. I'm gonna move to analogous wet on wet. So wet on wet, like I talked about before, we have to get the entire circle wet. Let that water soak into the paper just a touch. And we want to look for an analogous color scheme here. So going back to our color mixing project, analogous colors are colors that are neighbors on the color wheel, which means that they're next to each other, right? So usually what I tell students to do is pick like a primary color, like let's say red is our primary color, okay? And let's say your next door neighbor then would be red-violet. And let's say the next door neighbor to them would then be violet, okay? So if we take red and violet and we drop them in this analogous fill wash, we'll end up with some red-violet as they mix together, if that makes any kind of sense. Now, if we want to include more, we can like drop some blue in there, but analogous colors are next to each other. They harmonize, they have each other within them. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go with some red and some violet up in there. So really you're gonna pick like a secondary color, and then you're gonna pick the primary that's next to it, and you're gonna try to mix the intermediate up inside of there. As I've been talking, this dried out just a touch. I'm gonna add a little more water to it because I really want these to blend nicely. So I'm gonna go with some red, and I'm just gonna like, boom. Really, really just simple. And then I'm gonna go ahead and drop in a little bit of violet. Now violet's pretty powerful. It's gonna overtake that red quite a bit. So I don't wanna add quite as much into that. And now that I've like laid those colors, I'm just gonna add a little more water in there. I'm gonna let them do their thing, kind of swirl around somewhat. Students need to understand color schemes really well. Analogous color schemes are some of the easiest ones to pull off. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and move to wet on wet complements. I'm gonna go ahead and fill this like I did before, make it wet on wet. Now, complementary colors are exactly across from each other on the color wheel. So, where'd my Sharpie go? Oh, there it is. So pick any color, right, essentially. So let's say I pick blue, okay, just for the sake of argument. I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors on either side of that color, signifying what its complement will be. So that means orange is its complementary color. It's its exact opposite. Orange has everything in it that blue does not, and vice versa. They cause each other to look more intense because they're exactly contrasting one another in the color spectrum. I always taught my students how to memorize those kind of things by thinking about like Broncos colors, Vikings colors, and then Christmas colors, of course. But those two colors will make each other look more intense. And if you mix them, something happens. They become neutral colors. They turn into a brown or sometimes a greenish brown. So you can actually make brown. You don't have to use brown as a color itself. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop some orange. Let it spread. Clean my brush, dry my brush. Every time you switch colors, get used to that. And drop some blue in there. And if you feel like my blue's not spreading about, it's really not spreading as much as I'd like to, you can always add more water to that pigment. it's just going to slow down that time that you have to make that reflection on the flip grid because you have to wait for it to dry. So I should end up with some neutral colors up in there. Next thing I'm going to do is triadic. I'm still waiting on this to dry, of course, which that's one thing that I like about watercolor is that, you know, if you have a lot of different techniques, you can work on different areas, wait for different areas to dry and then come back to them. Triadic fill, wet on wet. Triadic color scheme involves colors that are separated equally on the color wheel, okay? So the most common example is yellow, red, and blue. They're primary colors. They're equally separated on the color wheel. The next most common example is violet, orange, and green. They are also equally separated on the color wheel. But you could use other colors if you wanted to, like intermediates, that kind of a thing, right? To keep this simple, I'm gonna go ahead and just use yellow, red, blue. We can obtain the entire spectrum of color with triadic color, and it's harmonious because we have something of the entire color spectrum represented in the work itself. So it's a complete color harmony as such. So I like to drop my yellow first because it gets easily overpowered. And then just like a color wheel, I'm gonna go ahead and drop my red over there. And then my blue on this other side. Now I really wanna get these to mix, right? So I might blow on them a little bit, or I might get some clean water and just see what I can do to force that mixture a little bit. But then once you see it mixing, leave it alone, right? Okay, I feel like this is about dry enough that we can come back to the red. Now remember, this is a wet on dry process, so we actually want this to be as dry as humanly possible. When we add the red, if your red is too wet, then you want to dry it off just a little bit. And I just like dabbed it across the edge of my watercolor pan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with that edge furthest away from the highlight like this. Now if I just keep doing this, it's just going to keep going red and red and red, and I don't really want that. So I actually have to clean my brush out now because I have like a pigment load inside of my red that's going to totally overtake that yellow, and I'm going to lose a lot of the dimensionality that I have there. So what I like to do, clean my brush out, dry it out, and I like to fan my brush out by like pulling it like this. And then I just take my brush and I come across it and I dry brush. And I just try to break that barrier. I kind of think about it like drawing rather. Like if I were shading, right? Now, of course, the paint has to be wet when you're doing this. So if your paint has dried a little bit during this time, then you might have to go back, get a little bit of water, add that to your brush, and then that'll be easier for you to move that pigment around. Now, if something happens in there and you're unhappy, like you can see that my red's really starting to progress up toward my yellow. I'm just trying to get it to diffuse a little bit. You can always get it wet, take a paper towel and dop it off of there. Works pretty well. But I'm just gonna smooth this out to the shape to try to get it to look as dimensional as possible. Now I need to let that dry so I can come back and hit it with blue. In the meantime, I'm gonna go ahead and work on my wet on dry modeled 1 color. So for this one, I'm gonna choose a darker color and not much pigment. So I just dipped barely into my pigmentation here. And again, I'm modeling all of these from the same direction. So I'm just gonna start to think of this like a marker. Think of it like a marker or a crayon or a pencil. And yeah, you're gonna get a lot of texture in here like this, right? This is called dry brushing. When we look at the differences here between this one and this one, and this one even, this one's gonna be a little bit choppier as such because of this. Because we're not really using water to blend. We're trying to use the pigment itself to blend. Now, one thing that you can do after you kind of get it roughly modeled, like once you feel like it looks like a sphere, like right now I've left a pretty good amount of white in this area here, and you know, doing a little bit of dry brushing, daubing in there. Then maybe what I want to do is get my brush a tiny bit wet, dry it out mostly, and then just go in there and really gently smooth these things over, just so they don't look quite so dramatically different, right? So the wet on dry affords you a little bit more control, but if you get really good with watercolor, you're gonna find that you like this whole wet on wet thing, because it's just so much faster. It's like incredibly faster. Okay, so by now I feel like this is probably dry enough for to approach with the blue. So again, wet on dry means I'm not gonna add any water to it. I'm just gonna go in there with the blue. Now in theory, I should get really close to a black back here. Doesn't always happen that way. Now I'm not going to go nearly as far out with this blue because I don't need those dark shadows up in there. The red is helping me with that. So now that I have laid down a basic foundation for that, I clean out my brush, I dry it out. I'm gonna fan it out like I did before, leave a little water in there. Now I'm gonna go in there and just try to smooth that out. I wanna get that red and that blue to mix. Now, if I don't have enough red left on my paper, one thing I can do is I can take a touch of red and I can go back in there and I can add that to my blue here to try to get more violets involved in there. So you're gonna have a full-on color spectrum really represented within this one here. You're gonna get a lot more realism there. Not liking this, so I'm probably gonna just add more water to that and correct it. So it's good that you're seeing that. When I've got a spot I don't like, I get it wet, I dab it off. Now what color was there before? Yellow, right? So that means I need to reapply yellow to bring it back to where it was before. What color was after that? Red. So that means I have to go back in with a touch more red and fix it. Looks pretty good now. So what was the final color? Blue. So now I'm gonna go back in there with a touch of blue. Not much at all. So I don't want to mess it up again, right? Clean my brush out, dry my brush out again, and just get a good smooth brush stroke in there. Boom. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about that. Looks like this probably needs a little bit more scumbling, so I'm just gonna like add a little bit of like water to that and try to get that a little less crazy hard, difficult. Okay, final thing here. And a lot of this is really pretty wet, unfortunately. For the sake of getting this demonstration done timely, I'm not going to worry about these things, but you may want to wait for these things to dry first since they're so close. Because if I lay this on top, it's going to spread and touch this. Hopefully that doesn't happen. We'll see what happens. But I'm going to lay my stencil right on top of the last piece. Now I'm gonna go ahead and break out the toothbrush. And if I were you, I would choose several different colors to do this. I'm gonna go with kind of a yellow, red, blue thing. I always like to practice my splattering first to see what it's gonna look like on some other area. That's looking pretty good. I'm getting some nice little marks there. I try to get it heavy on one side and not so much on another. I'm gonna clean my brush out now and move into a little bit of red. Of course, you can use any color you'd like. What I don't want is super big dots in there. I want small dots because it looks best if you build up a lot of small dots. I'm really trying to hit this edge heavily. I don't want a lot on that other side. It may take some practice. Let's see, we'll drop a little blue in there. I'm gonna test it on this white paper. See, that's really too big, so I'm gonna get a little bit of pigment out of there first until I feel, there we go. I like that dot matrix a lot better. I'm gonna go ahead and blend that up in there. I'm gonna get a little bit more blue on that side.
Kind of like spray paint.
Yeah, that's the whole goal, right? And you can layer these techniques as well. Ooh, it didn't mess up my other techniques. Okay, so now I'm ready for these things to all dry. Couple of things though, on this one, probably want to drop a shadow on it. That would help to really set that piece down. Same with this, since we're modeling those things. And so let me see here, it's violet. I'm gonna go really, really heavy violet underneath. Try to keep it all the same color if I can. And I want to just extend that oval underneath there. And then that other one there, actually violet would look really good underneath this one because there's a good deal of violet in this sphere itself. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint this out, drop and elongate that out to an oval type shape. I do a lot with circles and spheres because students seem to be able to understand those as really basic shape to form translations. Actually, it happens a lot in the college classes too. So, all right, that's it. Good luck with this thing. I'm looking forward to seeing what y'all come up with. Have fun with it, you know? Watercolor can be a tough medium. They call it the old man's medium. And it's not because I'm an old man, right? It's because it takes a lot of patience and planning and stuff. And so these techniques will help you with the idea of planning and help you understand how to show students how to plan out what they want to do in certain areas. Goodbye. Love you guys.